Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into a story of a pretty incredible reversal. How does a country go from being the richest in its entire region, sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, to a state of near total collapse? We're going to break down an article from the Atlas Society that offers one very powerful and pretty controversial explanation.
So the story the author tells really kicks off with this jarring contrast. It's a tale of two Venezuelas, really. On one side, you've got the Venezuela of the 20th century, a democratic powerhouse, the wealthiest nation in Latin America, with more oil than anyone else on the planet. And then, you look at the other side, Venezuela today, a place defined by widespread poverty and authoritarian rule. So the question at the heart of all this is simple, but it's also incredibly profound. How on earth did this happen?
If there's one single number that could capture the sheer insanity of the economic collapse described in this article, it's got to be this one. An annual inflation rate of 1,300,000%. That number is so big it's hard to even wrap your head around it. But for Venezuelans back in late 2018, it meant prices were literally doubling every 19 days. Your money, your life savings, it all became completely worthless.
But the article really stresses that behind these absolutely staggering economic numbers is a deeply human story. So let's take a look at the shocking human cost of this crisis.
And this is where the crisis stops being about economic theory and becomes the reality of just daily life. According to a living conditions survey that the article cites, a staggering 9 out of 10 people couldn't afford their daily food. Let that sink in. The source makes it crystal clear. This wasn't just about people tightening their belts. This was a full-blown humanitarian crisis of widespread hunger.
So, okay, how did Venezuela get to this point? To explain it, the author takes us back in time, to a really powerful socialist promise that kind of set the stage for all these dramatic changes.
The article argues that, look, pre-1998 Venezuela wasn't perfect. It had its own deep-seated problems. The author describes this system of crony capitalism, where you had a politically connected elite getting super rich from oil money while a lot of the population was really struggling. And all that discontent created the perfect, fertile ground for a totally new message. So in 1998, Hugo Chavez, a declared Marxist socialist, gets elected on this incredibly powerful promise. We are going to share the country's immense wealth, and we are finally going to end poverty.
And the initial reaction? It was just pure ecstasy and hope. You can just imagine the scene. The source describes people marching in the streets, celebrating, proclaiming that the day of the worker and the poor had come. For a lot of people, this wasn't just another political shift. It really felt like the dawn of a completely new era, a promise that the country's riches would finally benefit everyone.
But, as you might guess, that promise of a new era, well, it ran headfirst into reality. The article next details exactly how the economy started to just completely fall apart, laying out the specific policies and what happened because of them.
And this is a point the author just keeps coming back to, because it's so central to the whole story. This was not a country that lacked resources. Venezuela was, and still is, sitting on a literal ocean of oil, a massive, massive source of potential wealth.
And yet what happened? Despite all those massive reserves, production just tanked. The article points out that oil output, the very engine of the entire economy, plunged from 3 million barrels a day down to just 1 million. The source argues this was a direct result of taking money out of the industry for social spending and just failing to reinvest in its basic infrastructure.
So the author identifies this critical chain reaction, like a series of dominoes. First, the state nationalized key industries. Then, to try and fight rising prices, it slapped on these strict price controls. Well, the article argues the result was totally predictable. Severe shortages, because producers just couldn't afford to sell things at a loss. And the final step in this chain? When producers held back their goods, the government sent in soldiers to just take them.
Now, this economic breakdown, according to the source, didn't happen in a bubble. It went hand in hand with a major political transformation, which the author argues was a direct consequence of those economic policies. As the economic crisis got worse and worse, the government started to tighten its grip on power. The article details what it calls a systematic dismantling of democratic institutions. Opposition media suppressed. The fairness of elections suddenly in question. The judiciary was basically used to shut down the legislature. And protests were increasingly met with deadly force. And this wasn't just, some internal critics saying this. It was a big deal. The article cites the head of the Organization of American States, a major international body who flat out declared that the country had delivered the final blows to democracy and had become a dictatorship.
So what happens when your economy and your democracy collapse at the same time? People leave.
The source puts the number of refugees at 3 million. That's 3 million men, women, and children fleeing their own homes just to find food, medicine, and basic safety.
Okay, so all of this brings us to the final section. And this is where the author really zooms out from the specific events in Venezuela to present a much broader philosophical argument about what they believe happened. So to really get the author's point, we need to be super clear on how they define socialism for this argument. It's not about, say, a welfare state or high taxes. For the purposes of this article, it is defined very specifically as state control and ownership of the means of production. We're talking the factories, the farms, the industries, the whole shebang. And to hammer this point home, the article makes this really interesting comparison between Venezuela and Bolivia, which is another country with a self-proclaimed socialist leader. The author says, look, while both use socialist rhetoric, the key difference was the degree of the state takeover. In Venezuela, over 1,000 private companies were expropriated. In Bolivia, it was just 20. And for the author, that distinction is the critical factor that explains their totally different economic outcomes. And this all leads to the author's main philosophical punchline, which is inspired by the philosopher Ayn Rand. The central claim is this: without property rights, there can be no other rights. The logic they present is that if the state controls all the property, all the businesses, all the meeting halls, all the printing presses, then fundamental rights like free speech and free assembly basically cease to exist, because now you need the state's permission for everything.
So in the end, the article presents Venezuela's story as a kind of cautionary tale. It argues the crisis wasn't just about mismanagement or corruption, but the predictable endpoint of an ideology that centralizes all economic control. And it leaves us with a really provocative question. Does controlling a nation's economy inevitably lead to controlling its people? That's the core idea this source is asking us to think about. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.